The boy's hand trembled as he reached for the chocolate bar, his mother's warning still echoing in his mind. Stay away from the soldiers. But hunger had made him brave or perhaps desperate, and now an American stood before him, not with a rifle, but with something wrapped in strange brown paper that smelled sweeter than anything he could remember. The ruins of Osaka stretched in every direction, a graveyard of what had once been a thriving port city. Charred beams jutted from collapsed buildings like broken ribs, and the acrid smell of ash still clung to everything, even months after the last bombs had fallen. In the skeletal remains of what had been the Tanaka family's neighborhood, Kenji pressed himself against a crumbling wall, peering through a gap at the convoy of military trucks rolling down what used to be Sakura Street. The cherry trees that had given the road its name were gone, incinerated in the firestorms that had swept through the city the previous summer. His mother, Yuki, clutched his younger sister Hana close to her chest, her thin fingers white with tension. The little girl was only 4 years old, too young to remember the world before the war, before their father had left for the Pacific and never returned. Hana knew only hunger, only the hollow ache that had become as constant as breathing. Around them, other families huddled in similar poses of fearful anticipation. Old Mrs. Nakamura, who had lost her entire family in a single night of bombing, sat on a piece of broken concrete, her face an unreadable mask. Mr. Yoshida, the former shopkeeper whose store now existed only as a black stain on the pavement, stood with his arms crossed, jaw clenched. The rumors had been spreading for days. The Americans were coming. The conquerors, the enemy who had rained fire from the sky, who had reduced their cities to ash and their empire to surrender. Everyone had heard stories, whispered in the breadlines and the makeshift shelters. Some said the occupiers would be vengeful, that they would take the few resources that remained, that they would punish the civilian population for the sins of their military. Others predicted worse, horrors too terrible to speak aloud in front of the children. Yuki had spent the previous night lying awake on the thin mat that served as her family's bed, staring up through the holes in their roof at the stars. She had made Kenji and Hana memorize a plan. If soldiers came to their shelter, they were to run to the old temple ruins 3 blocks away. She had hidden their few remaining possessions, a dented cooking pot and her mother's silk scarf, beneath loose floorboards. She had nothing left to lose except her children, and she would die before letting harm come to them. But now, as the trucks rumbled to a stop and soldiers began jumping down onto the rubble-strewn street, something unexpected was happening. Instead of weapons being drawn, instead of shouted orders and aggressive postures, the soldiers were unloading crates. Large wooden boxes were being stacked on the street corner. Tables, long and sturdy, were being assembled with efficient precision. Yuki felt Kenji tense beside her, his 9-year-old body coiled like a spring, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. "Mama, what are they doing?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. She had no answer. This was not what she had expected, not what anyone had prepared for. Around them, other civilians were emerging from their hiding places, drawn by curiosity that warred with their terror. An elderly man shuffled forward, leaning heavily on a makeshift cane. A young woman with a baby strapped to her back stepped out from behind a partially collapsed wall. Slowly, cautiously, a crowd began to form, maintaining a careful distance from the soldiers, ready to scatter at the first hint of threat. The Americans worked with purpose, their movements practiced and efficient. One soldier, tall with red hair that caught the afternoon sun, was setting up what looked like a cooking station. Another, shorter and broader, was organizing cans into neat rows. A third, younger than the others with a face that still held traces of boyish uncertainty, was arranging bowls and cups on the tables. The civilians watched in confused silence, trying to understand what they were witnessing. Then the smell hit them. Rich, savory, impossible. Soup was heating in large metal pots, steam rising in fragrant clouds. The scent of cooked meat, of vegetables, of seasoning and sustenance, wafted across the destroyed street. Yuki felt her stomach clench painfully. She could not remember the last time she had smelled real food cooking. For months, they had survived on handfuls of rice mixed with sawdust to make it stretch further. on watery broth made from vegetable scraps scavenged from gutters, on hope and desperation. Hannah whimpered, pressing her face against her mother's shoulder. The child was so thin that Yuki could feel every rib, every vertebra, through her threadbare clothing. Kenji's hollow eyes were fixed on the pots of soup with an intensity that broke his mother's heart. She knew that look. She had seen it in mirrors, in the faces of everyone who had survived this far. It was the look of someone who had forgotten what it felt like to be full. The red-haired soldier stepped forward, and the crowd collectively flinched backward. He raised his hands, palms out, in what was clearly meant to be a gesture of peace. He said something in English, words that none of them understood, but his tone was gentle, almost pleading. He pointed to the tables, to the food, then gestured toward the children in the crowd. Another soldier joined him, this one with dark hair and a kind face, and he too was making encouraging gestures. No one moved. The distrust was too deep, the fear too ingrained. These were the men who had flown the planes, who had dropped the bombs, who had brought their world crashing down around them. How could they be offering food? What was the price? What cruel trick was this? The dark-haired soldier seemed to understand their hesitation. He walked slowly to one of the tables and picked up a bowl. He ladled soup into it, steam rising in lazy spirals. Then he brought the bowl to his lips and took a long sip, making a show of swallowing, of smiling with satisfaction. He set the bowl down and picked up a piece of bread, tearing off a chunk and eating it with visible enjoyment. The message was clear. The food was real, and it was not poisoned. Still, the crowd remained frozen. Weeks of propaganda, months of war, years of being taught that the enemy was inhuman and cruel, these things could not be undone with a single gesture. But hunger was a force stronger than fear, stronger than pride, stronger than anything except perhaps a parent's love for their child. The young soldier, the one with the boyish face, reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and brown. He unwrapped it, and even from a distance, Yuki could see it was chocolate. He looked around at the crowd, searching for someone, and his eyes landed on Kenji. Perhaps he saw something in the boy's face, some mixture of longing and terror that called to him. He took a step forward, then another, moving with exaggerated slowness, holding the chocolate bar out like an offering. Yuki's grip on Kenji tightened. Every instinct screamed at her to pull him back, to protect him, to not let him anywhere near the soldiers. But Kenji was pulling away from her, his hunger overriding his caution. She watched, helpless and terrified, as her son took a tentative step forward, then another. The crowd held its collective breath. The soldier knelt down when Kenji was a few feet away, bringing himself to the boy's eye level. He extended the chocolate bar further, his face open and earnest. Kenji looked back at his mother, seeking permission or perhaps reassurance. Yuki found herself nodding, though her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Kenji reached out with both hands and took the chocolate bar. The soldier released it and sat back on his heels, giving the boy space. For a long moment, Kenji just stared at what he was holding, turning it over in his small, dirty hands. Then, with aching slowness, he peeled back the wrapper and broke off a piece. He put it in his mouth. The transformation on the child's face was instantaneous and heartbreaking. His eyes went wide with wonder, with disbelief, with joy so pure it seemed to radiate from him like light. He had never tasted chocolate before. Before the war, such luxuries had been rare, expensive, reserved for special occasions. During the war, sugar itself had become a distant memory. Now, the sweetness exploding across his tongue was like a revelation, like discovering that color existed after a lifetime of seeing only gray. A sound escaped Kenji, half laugh and half sob, and he broke off another piece, shoving it into his mouth with trembling fingers. The soldier was smiling now, a genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He reached out and gently ruffled Kenji's hair, and the boy, instead of flinching away, looked up at him with gratitude so profound it needed no translation. That single moment shattered the ice of fear that had gripped the crowd. Murmurs rippled through the assembled civilians, a sound like wind through grass. Other children began to edge forward, emboldened by Kenji's experience. Parents, torn between protective instincts and the desperate need to feed their starving offspring, loosened their grips. The soldiers, sensing the shift in atmosphere, began gesturing more enthusiastically, calling out in their incomprehensible language, beckoning the children closer. A little girl, perhaps 6 years old with tangled black hair and a dress that was more patches than original fabric, took 3 quick steps forward and then stopped, paralyzed by her own daring. The red-haired soldier noticed her and walked over to one of the tables. He picked up a bowl and filled it with soup, thick with vegetables and chunks of meat that seemed impossibly luxurious. He approached the girl slowly, crouching down to offer her the bowl. She took it with both hands, her small fingers barely able to grip the warm ceramic. She looked into the bowl as if it contained liquid gold, then up at the soldier with an expression of such raw vulnerability that several people in the crowd began to cry. The soldier nodded encouragingly, miming the action of eating. The girl lifted the bowl to her lips and took a sip, then another. Then she was gulping it down, barely pausing to breathe, soup dribbling down her chin as she drank with the desperation of the truly starving. That broke the dam entirely. Children surged forward, no longer held back by their parents' fear. They clustered around the tables, clutching bowls and cups that the soldiers pressed into their hands. The Americans moved among them with a strange gentleness, ladling soup, cutting bread, opening cans of milk. They smiled and spoke words that meant nothing to the recipients but were delivered with such warmth that the meaning transcended language. Yuki found herself moving forward too, Hannah still in her arms. The little girl was reaching out toward the tables, making small sounds of longing. A soldier with gray at his temples, old enough to be a father himself, noticed them approaching. He picked up a cup and filled it with milk, white and pure and thick. He held it out to Hannah, and the child grabbed it with both hands, nearly dropping it in her eagerness. Yuki watched her daughter drink, watched the white liquid disappear down her throat, and felt something break inside her chest. Tears began streaming down her face, hot and unstoppable. She had not cried during the bombings, not when they had received word of her husband's death, not through all the months of starvation and struggle. But seeing her child fed, seeing kindness where she had expected only cruelty, this undid her completely. The gray-templed soldier was holding out a bowl of soup to her now, and she took it with shaking hands. She brought it to her lips and tasted warmth, tasted sustenance, tasted life. The soup was simple, basic military rations, but to her it was ambrosial. She could feel it spreading through her body, bringing strength to limbs that had been weak for so long. Around her, the street was transforming. Where there had been fear and suspicion, now there was something almost like celebration. Children were eating with both hands, bread in one and chocolate in the other. Mothers were weeping as they watched their babies fed. Old men who had been proud and stern were accepting bowls with trembling gratitude. The soldiers moved among them like servants at a feast, constantly refilling bowls, offering more food, encouraging everyone to take as much as they needed. Kenji appeared at Yuki's side, his face smeared with chocolate and his eyes bright with an emotion she had not seen in him for over a year. Happiness. The young soldier who had given him the chocolate bar was standing nearby, and Kenji turned to him and bowed, a deep, formal bow of respect and thanks. The soldier looked surprised, then awkwardly attempted to bow back. His form was terrible, his back not straight enough, his angle all wrong, but the sincerity of the gesture was unmistakable. The soldier said something in English, and though Yuki could not understand the words, she heard the tone. Kind, humble, human. He was not a conqueror dispensing charity from on high. He was simply a man, probably not much older than 20, trying to do something good in a world that had seen too much evil. An older woman pushed through the crowd, and Yuki recognized her as Mrs. Kimura, whose son had died in the Battle of Okinawa. The woman's face had been carved into a mask of grief and bitterness, and she had spoken often and loudly about her hatred for the Americans who had killed her only child. She was walking directly toward the gray-templed soldier, and Yuki felt a flash of alarm. What was she planning? But Mrs. Kimura's hands were empty of weapons. Instead, she was carrying a bowl, and she was approaching the soldier with measured, deliberate steps. She stopped in front of him, and for a long moment, they simply looked at each other. The soldier seemed to sense the weight of this encounter, the significance of it. He stood very still, waiting. Mrs. Kimura held out the empty bowl. The soldier took it and filled it with soup, his movements careful and respectful. He handed it back to her, and their fingers touched briefly as she accepted it. In that fleeting contact, something passed between them, some acknowledgement of shared humanity, of suffering on both sides, of the universal truth that war leaves no one untouched. Mrs. Kimura brought the bowl to her lips and drank. When she lowered it, there were tears on her weathered cheeks. She bowed to the soldier, a bow that conveyed more than words ever could. "I see you. I acknowledge you. I accept this offering." The soldier bowed back, and this time his form was better, as if he understood that this was a moment requiring dignity and precision. Around them, other interactions were playing out. A toddler was offering a soldier a pebble she had found in the rubble, presenting it with the solemnity of a child giving a treasured gift. The soldier accepted it with equal gravity, examining the small stone as if it were a precious jewel. A teenage boy was attempting to communicate with another soldier using hand gestures and drawings in the dust, both of them laughing at their mutual incomprehension and determination to understand each other anyway. Mr. Yoshida, the former shopkeeper who had stood apart from the crowd with such rigid suspicion, was now sitting on a chunk of broken wall with a bowl of soup in his hands. His face was wet with tears, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. A soldier sat down beside him, not saying anything, just offering his presence. They sat together in silence, two men who had been enemies, united now by exhaustion and relief and the simple act of breaking bread together. As the afternoon wore on, the food kept coming. The soldiers seemed to have an endless supply, and they pressed it on anyone who would take it. Children who had eaten until their shrunken stomachs protested were given cans of food to take home. Mothers were given bags of rice and flour. The elderly were offered medicine and bandages for wounds that had gone untreated for months. Yuki found herself sitting on the ground with Hana in her lap and Kenji beside her. All three of them eating slowly, savoring every bite. The young soldier who had given Kenji the chocolate approached them again, and this time he was carrying a blanket, thick and warm. He offered it to Yuki, and she accepted it with another bow, clutching the soft fabric to her chest. At night, when the temperature dropped, they had been sleeping huddled together under a single thin sheet. This blanket would be the difference between shivering through the darkness and actually sleeping. The sun was beginning to set, painting the ruined city in shades of gold and orange. The fires that had once illuminated these streets had been terrifying, instruments of destruction. But this light, natural and gentle, seemed to promise something different. It illuminated faces that were smiling for the first time in months, bellies that were finally full, eyes that held something other than despair. The soldiers began packing up their equipment as darkness approached, but they left behind bags and crates of food stacked neatly on the tables. They left instructions through gestures and simple drawings. More food would come tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. This was not a single act of charity but an ongoing commitment. They would not let these people starve. As the trucks prepared to leave, children ran alongside them, waving and calling out words of thanks in Japanese that the soldiers could not understand but clearly appreciated. The soldiers waved back, their faces reflecting a mixture of emotions. Satisfaction, sadness, hope. They had been trained as warriors taught to kill and destroy. But in this moment, they had been transformed into something else. Deliverers of mercy, builders of bridges, agents of peace. Yuki watched them go, Kenji pressed against her side and Hana asleep in her arms, her small belly full for the first time in memory. She thought about the morning, about her terror and her warnings to her children. She thought about her expectations of violence and cruelty. She had been so certain of what would happen, so prepared for the worst, and she had been entirely wrong. The ruins around them were unchanged. The buildings were still collapsed, the streets still littered with debris, the scars of war still written across every surface. But something fundamental had shifted. The Americans had not come with weapons drawn and vengeance in their hearts. They had come with soup and bread and chocolate. They had knelt down to the level of children and offered them food. They had treated the defeated not as conquered subjects to be punished, but as human beings to be helped. It would take more than one meal to heal the wounds of war. It would take years, perhaps generations, to fully overcome the hatred and suspicion that had been cultivated so carefully on both sides. But this was a beginning, fragile and tentative as a seedling pushing up through scorched earth. In a place where only bitterness and hunger should have grown, something else was taking root. The possibility of forgiveness, the potential for peace. Mr. Nakamura, an old man who had lost his 3 sons in the war, was sitting alone on a pile of rubble, staring at an empty can of food that he was turning over and over in his hands. Yuki watched as he finally set it down carefully, almost reverently, next to him. He looked up at the darkening sky, and his lips moved in what might have been a prayer or simply a word of thanks. Even he, who had every reason to hate, was beginning to soften. Kenji was already asleep, exhausted by emotion and a full stomach. Yuki adjusted the new blanket around him and looked down at her children's faces, peaceful in slumber. For months, she had gone to bed each night wondering if they would survive another day, if she could find enough food to keep them alive just a little longer. Tonight, she did not have to wonder. Tonight, they were safe and fed and warm. She thought about the young soldier with the chocolate, about his awkward bow and his earnest face. She thought about the gray-templed man who had given her the blanket, about the kindness in his eyes. These were people who had been her enemies, who had fought against her country, whose bombs had destroyed her city and killed her husband. But they had also been the ones to feed her children when they were starving, to offer warmth when they were cold, to extend mercy when they could have demanded retribution. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The city was still in ruins. There were still shortages of everything: housing, medicine, work, hope. The road to recovery would be long and difficult. But tonight, in this moment, there was enough. There was food in their bellies and a blanket for warmth and the memory of kindness where they had expected only cruelty. As full darkness fell, small fires began to appear across the ruined neighborhood. Families huddled around flames built from scraps of wood, cooking the rice and heating the soup they had been given. The air filled with the smell of food being prepared, with the sound of voices speaking softly, with the sense that perhaps the worst was over. Perhaps, against all odds, they would survive this. Perhaps they would even rebuild. Yuki pulled her children close under the blanket, feeling their small bodies pressed against hers, hearing their steady breathing. The stars came out overhead, visible through the gaps where buildings used to stand. She had wished on those stars so many times during the war, had prayed to them for her husband's safe return, for an end to the bombing, for just one more day with her children. Tonight, she whispered a different kind of prayer. A prayer of gratitude for the unexpected kindness of strangers, for the simple miracle of a shared meal, for the fragile hope that perhaps enemies could become something else. In the distance, she could hear other voices, other families settling in for the night. Someone was singing softly, a lullaby she recognized from her own childhood. Someone else was laughing, a sound so rare and precious it made her throat tighten with emotion. This was what the soldiers had given them, more valuable than the food and blankets. They had given them permission to hope again, to believe that there might be a future worth living for. The night grew deeper, and the fires burned lower, and across the ruined city of Osaka, people slept with full stomachs for the first time in months. They slept with softened hearts and open minds. They slept knowing that when tomorrow came, the soldiers would return with more food, more kindness, more of these small gestures that were rebuilding trust one bowl of soup at a time. Yuki lay awake a while longer, listening to the breathing of her children, feeling the weight of them against her. She thought about what she would tell them in the morning, how she would explain this transformation in her understanding of the world. She thought about the lessons she had taught them before, lessons about enemies and hate and the necessity of survival at any cost. Those lessons would need to be unlearned, replaced with something more complex and more true. That people were capable of both terrible cruelty and unexpected compassion. That enemies could become friends, that even in the darkest times, human kindness could break through like light through cracks in a wall. The young soldier's face came back to her, his expression as he handed Kenji that chocolate bar. He had looked almost nervous, almost hopeful, as if he too needed this moment of connection, needed to give kindness as much as they needed to receive it. Perhaps, she thought, he had seen things in the war that haunted him. Perhaps feeding starving children was his way of trying to balance some internal scale, to add something good to a ledger that contained too much death and destruction. Or perhaps he was simply a decent person trying to do the right thing in impossible circumstances. Whatever his motivations, the result was the same. Her children would live to see another day. Not just survive, but truly live, with full bellies and the knowledge that the world contained kindness as well as cruelty. That was a gift beyond measure, worth more than gold or jewels or any material treasure. It was the gift of hope, and it had been given freely by hands that could have been clenched into fists but instead were opened in offering. As sleep finally claimed her, Yuki's last conscious thought was of tomorrow. The soldiers would return, and she would be there with her children. She would bow to them again, would try to express through gesture what she could not say in words. Thank you for seeing us as human. Thank you for feeding our children. Thank you for choosing mercy over revenge. Thank you for giving us a reason to believe that this broken world could someday be made whole again. And in the morning, when the trucks rolled back into the ruined streets of Osaka, the crowds that gathered would be different. The fear would be gone, replaced by anticipation. The suspicion would be tempered by trust. The civilians and the soldiers would smile at each other, would share the universal language of kindness that needed no translation. They would eat together, would laugh together, would begin the slow, difficult, beautiful work of building peace from the ashes of war. Because in the end, that was what this moment had taught them all. That bread could replace bullets, that compassion could overcome hate, that a simple meal shared between former enemies could be the first step on a long journey toward reconciliation. The war had taught them how to fear and hate each other. Now, one bowl of soup at a time, they were learning something harder and more precious. How to forgive, how to hope, and how to see the humanity in those they had been taught to consider monsters. The ruins of Osaka would stand for years as a reminder of what had been lost. But on this night, as families slept under blankets provided by former enemies, as children dreamed with full stomachs, as hearts began the slow process of softening toward those who had fed them in their time of greatest need, something new was being built among the rubble. Not with bricks and mortar, but with acts of kindness and gestures of goodwill. Not grand or dramatic, but quiet and persistent as seeds pushing through scorched earth toward the light. This was the beginning of peace. Not in treaties signed or speeches given, but in the simple, revolutionary act of one human being feeding another, of seeing past the uniform and the propaganda to the person underneath, of choosing compassion when cruelty would have been easier. And though none of them could know it yet, this moment, this sharing of food between enemies in a destroyed city, would echo forward through generations, becoming the foundation on which two nations would build an unlikely friendship, proving that even the deepest wounds of war could begin to heal when people chose kindness over hate.